Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me here. Let me just see if I can figure out how to, maybe this one. Ah, there we go. And yeah, thank you so much, Paul, and everyone else for inviting me here today. My job as a brain scientist is to talk to you about the fighting brain. I was trying to figure out, how does this work? How does UCLA organize a symposium on the martial arts? So I went back to our mission statement at UCLA. And as you can see, UCLA's primary purpose as a public research university is to create, disseminate, preserve, and apply knowledge for the betterment of our global society. And it became very clear to me that that was what Paul was encouraging, was the creation, right? The preservation, dissemination, and application of knowledge, or else, right? What I wanted to do is tell you a little bit of a story as how I, as a naive brain scientist, totally white belt in any other capacity, but tried to understand, well, what is it that martial arts does? How does it fit in with our psychology, with our brain function, and with human evolution? And to do so, I think it's important to go back in time, and I'm talking about way back. So here we have life as it was present about 1 billion years ago. Does everybody recognize this organism? This is the well-known dinoflagellate, right? Single-celled organism. So you know where its brain is? Well, it doesn't have a brain. It's a single cell, so it doesn't even have neurons. It's just a single cell. It's not a he or a she, it's an it, because they're not capable of sexual reproduction, but it does some really important things. It has sensors all over the top of the animal, and it's got a tail. In this case, it's got 3 tails. It's pretty fancy, and those can wiggle. And then it's got stuff inside the animal that helps to connect the sensation of light on the surface with the motion of the tail. This is a very simple coupling mechanism. So if the head is pointed up towards the sunlight, the tail wiggles faster. That's basically all the thing does. But just by that, that's a lot. I mean, compared to the things that went before 1 billion years, the previous couple billion years didn't have things this fancy. But what this animal is able to do, just by sensing light at the top of the animal and wiggling a tail at the bottom of the animal, it does something that's really interesting. What's going to happen if it's pointed towards the light and it wiggles its tail? If it's not pointed towards the light, it doesn't wiggle its tail. It's going to end up near the light. It's going to be near the surface of the ocean where it's got more light, so it can acquire more energy, and there's more food, because that's where other little critters that it likes to absorb nutrients from exist. So just the simplest possible mechanism of input coming into the top, output going out the bottom, and some coupling mechanism has balanced the dynamics of how this animal interacts with the environment in a way that enables it to function better and live longer and better. Now, how does that relate possibly to human beings? Well, if we go forward 1 billion years, what we can see is that this fundamental input, output, and balancing mechanism in between has just evolved a little bit, but we could see it evolving in a series of layers where the most basic and fundamental core brain functions have been elaborated over time. So 315 million years ago, we had reptiles that were capable of executing most of the core brain functions, still processing inputs, more complicated outputs, and coupling of the inputs with the outputs. And then, over time, we developed another paleo-mammalian or ancient mammalian set of functions. That brings us up to about 200 million years ago. And then 85 million years ago, we developed this so-called neo-mammalian cortex. That's what we share, along with certain apes, the highest forms of brain control. But still, we're processing inputs, we're executing outputs, and we're balancing the coordination of these two things. Now you may wonder, well, what are those core things? What goes on in this core brain that we all share? And for that, I like to use the analogy of the 4 F's that have been well known to represent core brain functions in human biology. And that includes the feeding, right? We have to be able to eat and sustain ourselves. Fleeing, we have to be able to escape enemies when we're under attack. You guys know about that. And then, of course, most central to this group, fighting is one of the things. We have to be able to confront our enemies. And then, of course, the fourth F is reproductive behavior. But if we come back to this model of the brain, of how baked into our core brain we have these four Fs being mediated at the most primitive reptilian brain, you can imagine a reptile executing each one of those four kinds of activities. As evolution has continued, we've developed these other systems to provide regulation over all the lower levels and a more sophisticated way of processing those things. So feeding is a good example. Now, reptiles feed on just about anything, but one of the key points in the emergence of the mammalian brain is an extra layer of controls that keeps us from doing certain things and being more selective in those processes. So, for example, in feeding, we do something really important that reptiles are not so great at, and that is we do not eat our offspring. This is really important. Paul, remember this, now that you have a child. No eating the babies. He's taking notes. It's a good thing. There are other things about this ancient mammalian system that have been designed to help perpetuate our species. One of them is the presence of enhanced maternal behavior. In addition to not eating the offspring, it turns out that this primitive mammalian brain also endows mothers with an ability to be sensitive to separation cries so that they will go and take care of their offspring. And this is really important because human offspring are really bad at fending for themselves. In part, that's probably due to the fact that they have really big brains, so they can't really move around. Unlike a colt, if anyone has ever seen a colt delivered from the womb, they hit the ground and they can run pretty quickly. But try that with a human. I don't think you're going to get so far. Humans, it is now known, are dependent on their parents up until either they complete graduate school or the age of 40, whichever comes later, right? So then we have this highest neo-mammalian level of development, and that even exerts controls over those other lower levels. It's with this highest level of primate development in the brain that we're endowed with capacities not only to control these more fundamental drives, but also to delay the gratification of those drives, to develop strategies to determine how to regulate our other brain functions, and to determine what is plan B. If plan A doesn't work, to keep in storage another plan, another option, another strategy that will help if things don't go well. So anyhow, we have all of these tools, and what have we done with it? Well, I think there we can step forward from 85 million years ago to about 4,000 years ago, and the development of certain practices that have become well understood to take advantage of our fancy brains and how we go about regulating all of these lower impulses. And here I bring up the eternal knot that comes out of Tibetan Buddhism that, for me, relates very neatly to the brain because it doesn't start and it doesn't end. It emphasizes this balance of input, output, and the connection between those, their fundamental regulation. And above all, it emphasizes the balance of opposing forces. And I think this is one of the key things that these ancient practices have done for us, is focus on how we develop balance in the control of our thoughts and the control of our minds and bodies working together synergistically. Now, that's led to a number of key practices that you guys know much better than I. There's a huge amount of research already on brain and behavior with various kinds of soft martial arts and with other practices, including meditation, yoga, Tai Chi. The one thing that is a critical ingredient that runs across all of these practices, as you can see, is having a camera in front of you and a rising sun behind you. Right? I mean, that seems apparent. But in reality, what we've done through studying these practices is determine that they have huge impacts on our brain function, our brain structure, and on the capacity to engage in productive thought. And each one of these practices emphasizes a certain balance in the study of brain and behavior. We know that these practices are associated with enhancing well-being, and we've been able to drill down to some of the basic mechanisms that mediate those effects. And here, as you can easily see in this simple diagram, Well, actually, I think this diagram may highlight, in fact, what are the complexities of mind-body therapies of various kinds, and I think that all the things that I've described so far would fit into this overall diagram. But one of the things I like about it is it emphasizes not only the mind and brain, but also the rest of the body, and it highlights the impact of both top-down features in the control of our psychophysical instrument, and also the bottom-up features, so that in the top-down features, we can think about the importance of these highest levels of our brain in focusing our attention, in enabling cognitive control over more primitive mind and brain functions, while at the same time, the habitual practices that emerge through any kinds of well-organized, structured physical activity, the learning of a practice, the learning of habits, learning how to control our breathing, learning how to control other aspects of our physical body, has bottom-up influences on our mind as well. And it's really the balance of these forces that enables the power of these practices to be exerted. And one of the things that is amazing is that the science has now shown us how these fundamental practices translate into physiological effects all the way down to the molecular level. So what happens when one is engaged in these practices is you are actually changing the way that your DNA is read out to cause the formation of proteins in different forms, to influence the very cells that make up your body and that form the biological systems in your body. And one of the interesting things highlighted over here are a series of small cellular elements that are actually moderated by the learning of the practices that we've just discussed, and that will alter our sense of well-being through their regulation. So there's a bunch of little chemicals that are called cytokines. They're part of our immune system. They're associated with inflammation. When they are triggered and proliferate, we feel sick. If we have learned certain practices from yoga, tai chi, meditation practices, martial arts, we actually promote the countering of the proliferation of those sickness or illness or bad feeling inducing chemicals and regulate them better through the control of these inflammatory processes. So indeed, the fundamental molecular mechanisms underlying how it is that these kinds of practices may enhance well-being are now at hand. And you would think that we might be able to learn how to maximize those. No neuroscientist could talk to you without showing you pictures of the brain. Usually we like to show colorful pictures of the brain because they're far more persuasive, but indeed there have been summarized in this one slide more than 78 studies primarily on softer martial arts or other meditative or contemplative practices. But what's interesting is that each one of these different components of contemplative practice, focused attention, open monitoring, mantra recitation, or loving kindness and compassion forms of meditation, has been associated with unique patterns of change in brain function. The one thing that is shared across these different practices is that there are both activations of some regions and deactivations of other regions, thus again revealing a fundamental complementarity or balance in the kinds of changes that take place in the brain as we acquire these kinds of practices. So I find that to be quite interesting, that this fundamental theme of balance is represented again. Now, what could we do with that? How could we learn more about how these things work? Well, I got involved in this work because of this mild-mannered dance professor who 4 or 5 years ago took up martial arts. This is Janet O'Shea. I think she started hanging out with Paul, the British ninja McCarthy, and started learning to fight and kill with these sticks. And she developed, though, a fundamental question. She found that as she was starting to practice in martial arts, that she developed a kind of a brain scramble. That's how she described it. It was a feeling of discomfort of trying to acquire the, and this is a dancer who is well accustomed to acquiring new movements, but she found that there was something particularly challenging about this form of hard martial arts that exceeded the other kinds of dance practices and other physical athletic activities that she'd done before. And she had the question, well, what does this do to our mind? what does it do to our brains? And so she called me up out of the blue and said, Dr. Bilder, can you help us with this kind of a study? And I said, well, why not? I'll try anything twice. It was based on that we got together with Paul and decided to try to study this and see what does it do to our cognitive abilities. Unfortunately, in doing any kind of research like this, you need to have a control condition. Fortunately, we were able to identify someone from UCLA Recreation, Alyssa Terry, who is an amazing trainer in physical and aerobic activities. Some of you may know Alyssa. She had brutalized me as part of the Bruin B-HIP program, which takes a bunch of old, out-of-shape professors and tries to wrangle them a little bit into better-shaped professors. But she's really a wonderful trainer, and she developed a control condition, which we wanted to match with the Filipino martial arts condition in terms of the amount of duration of exposure, the amount of physical aerobic activity, et cetera. And we recruited a bunch of people into these treatments, randomized them, just the way scientists do, and then we wanted to study a bunch of cognitive and brain functions. And so there, we wanted to sample across various kinds of cognitive domains. There are things we call working memory, the ability to keep things in mind long enough to use them, processing speed, response inhibition, this kind of a cognitive control, the processes of convergent thinking, mental rotation abilities, and then also some psychological processes, including satisfaction with life, the expression of positive and negative affect, and subjective well-being. So we looked at all of these functions. And what do you think we found in comparing the hard martial arts, which some of you are experts in, to just aerobic exercise? Well, what we found is that both practices were actually good at improving almost everything here. And we really had to struggle to find, well, what was the unique added benefit of doing the hard martial arts? And there was one area where we found that there might be a critical difference, and that was mental rotation abilities. This little chart, which shows us how people proceeded from before and after the treatment, showed some change. There was a little bit of a gain just from the exercise condition, but fighting really led to a quite dramatic increase in this kind of three-dimensional spatial rotation process. And these are the kind of problems that people learn to solve. And I don't know how many people can, solve these problems, but here you see the goal is to take that figure, you can rotate it any which way and determine which one of these alternatives is it the same as. Has anybody got some ideas about which one it is? Yeah. I think it's the third one from the left, right? I'm actually pretty confident about that answer. But then try this one. Yeah, which one is that? Has everybody got that one? Just try it out in your mind. Rotate it around. You guys are martial artists. I thought everybody was going to be yelling out. What number is that one? The last, yeah, number 4. I think that's what I came up with. But this one, by doing this one, it actually hurts my mind. I mean, maybe it's easy for you martial artists, but I found it to be very difficult. And what about this one? Yeah, that one I think is actually the third one. But again, this is the kind of thing, you could tell me I'm wrong, and I'll believe you guys. But I think you can get a feeling for how this kind of mental manipulative skill relates to some of the practices that you must maintain in mind, managing your entire body relative to another person's body in three-dimensional space in real time, and in fact, in accelerated time as you're under the pressure of being killed. That I believed, it wasn't exactly what we thought we would discover, but as we looked through literature, it made some sense. One well-known neuroscientist, Adele Diamond, felt that the kind of bimanual coordination, eye-hand coordination, would be particularly valuable in enhancing cognitive performance. And then some other studies have indeed focused on the distinction between aerobic exercise and the kinds of exercises that are engaged in martial arts, involving and focusing on complex motor coordination in three-dimensional space as being key elements of that. So indeed, there may be elements of this that are quite true, yet I think it still leaves us with interesting questions. And like any research study, leaves us probably with more questions than answers about what are the added components of learning to manage, to express aggression and to control aggression in the way that is helping to manage these core brain functions that are deep within each of us? What is it about those practices that make a difference? And indeed, we as UCLA Bruins designed to create, disseminate, preserve, and apply knowledge, I think that's a layer that we need to dig into more deeply to understand. How is it that we can learn dealing with these core brain functions, dealing with the balance of fighting and fleeing, dealing with how that is implemented through our psychological and physiological systems? How can we learn from understanding these arts and their effects on the mind and brain, how to do a better job of contributing to the global betterment of society? So with that, I'll thank you all for listening, and thank my collaborators Janet O'Shea, Paul McCarthy, Elisa Terry, and a UCLA Transdisciplinary Seed Grant that helped to support our work. Thank you very much for listening.